Hi there friends, welcome back to the channel. My name's Matt, I'm an economics graduate and Big Four qualified accountant, and today I'm going to talk about the difficulty level associated with completing a Big Four audit graduate scheme to hopefully give anybody thinking of applying a slightly better idea of what to expect. I'm going to focus on the actual day job rather than the ACA exams, which is a completely different kettle of fish, and each exam is so different in its own right. They probably deserve a video of their own and not one for today. Now obviously difficulty is a pretty complicated term with loads of nuance associated to it. What I might find really challenging, someone else might find really easy, and vice versa. Everyone's got different skill sets, so to cast a blanket opinion over all of this can be quite tough, but I will try and explain myself as best I can as we go through the video. So as someone who was pretty good at maths at school, albeit I did scrape my way through a couple of English exams, I like to think a lot about the world in terms of numbers and scales and graphs, and that's how I'm going to try and present this little explanation. Broadly speaking, I think there are two different categories of work you'll do whilst on a Big Four audit grad scheme. There is the absolute nuts and bolts, bare minimum type stuff, and then on top of that there's an extra layer of work which is almost slightly optional in some respects, depending on exactly how far you want to push yourself and go the extra mile. And I think recognising these two things is pretty important when it comes to trying to tackle the question of difficulty. So here goes. Let's start off with a good old scale of 1 to 10 and overlaying onto this various elements of life which most people will be able to relate to. But for the purposes of this, we're going to break the 10 points up into two different buckets. 5 points for the complexity and 5 points for the quantity or volume of work. So let's start off with GCSEs. For me, these weren't too tough. I went to a good school and I was really mollycoddled throughout the whole process. So I'm going to slot this in as a 2 for complexity and a 3 in terms of volume. I suppose trying to balance 10 subjects at the same time does add an element of difficulty from that perspective. That obviously adds up to a 5 overall, and I hope you're still with me so far. Moving on to A-levels, I think there's definitely a jump up in terms of the difficulty of the actual underlying subject matter, particularly A-level physics, which is definitely not the one. So I think I'll give that a 3 out of 5 in terms of complexity, and stick with a 3 when it comes to volume. Broadly speaking, I was at the same school, I had the same number of lessons, albeit covering a different number of subjects, so about the same quantity of work as a GCSE, I'd say. So we've taken one step up overall, and A-levels are slotting into our little graph as a 6 out of 10. Next up is my economics degree. This was pretty tough in a lot of areas, modules like econometrics, data analysis, quantitative economics. We went pretty deeply into what was actually a well-defined set of topics. So I'm going to say for this a 5 out of 5 in terms of complexity, but then dropping down to a 2 in terms of volume, giving us a 7 in total. So overall the hardest so far, which I think is about right. So now we come on to the Big Four grad scheme. And in the first instance, let's talk about that bare minimum work threshold that I mentioned earlier. During your first few years, you really won't be doing anything too complex, and everything that you do will be prescriptively laid out step by step by your manager, who will typically be a field manager with about 3 years of experience. You'll be tasked with a high volume of easy jobs, things like going through and summarising hundreds of PDF invoices into Excel, researching historic foreign exchange rates for a range of dates, and digging down into items included on bank reconciliations to better understand them. So for the purposes of our scale, the complexity is probably a 2. During your first 18 months or so, I think it's fair to say there's nothing you'll be asked to do that you couldn't have done back when you were doing your GCSEs. The difference comes in terms of quantity of work, which we're going to slot in at a 4. There's always plenty to do, and when you finish one thing, the field manager will be waiting for you and be ready to give you something else. So in total, I'm saying the overall difficulty level of all this is broadly equivalent to doing your A-levels, about a 6 out of 10. But as I mentioned, this is only the baseline level of difficulty that you'll need to be able to cope with in order to survive. If you're looking to thrive, then managers will be expecting you to push yourself from both a quantity and quality angle. Obviously, there's still loads of protection for the more junior members of staff, and it's in absolutely no one's interest for you to be out of your depth. But if you show a real interest and come across as keen and engaged, you'll certainly be trusted with more interesting and elaborate stuff, pushing this side of things up to say a 3.5. And as I mentioned, when you're in the middle of an audit, it feels almost like there's a bottomless pit of work to try and get through. And if you show willing to work every evening and get in early every morning, there's absolutely no reason why the volume of work will be anything less than a 5, which gives us an 8.5 in total. So, and how we breathe. Hopefully you're still with me. Apologies for feeling the need to crack out this little diagram, but I do think it's important to understand that there is an element of nuance to this issue. We haven't even touched on the fact that someone might find talking to the client the most daunting thing in the world, which automatically pushes things up from a 2 to a 4 in their mind. I think it's only really possible to do this sort of thing in pretty general terms, but hopefully the position we've arrived at makes sense to a lot of you. The key takeaway from all this really is that it's very much the volume of work rather than the complexity of it that'll cause you struggles whilst at the Big Four. And also that the ball is in your court to an extent on exactly how much work you do want to take on, which I think is really important and is something I hadn't fully appreciated prior to starting my job. So I'm more than happy to add any further detail. If anyone is interested or intrigued, please do drop me a message down in the comments down below and I'll certainly get back to you. For now, I'm going to go for a little lie down. That analysis was up there at something close to a 10 out of 10. I promise to bring something slightly more light-hearted in the next video. I'll hopefully see you in that one, but until then, stay safe and bye-bye.